Does anyone know the saying, jack of all trades? It refers to a person who can do many different types of work. The saying is actually part of a whole quote. A jack of all trades is a master of none, but oftentimes better than a master of one. In the case of diesel locomotives, you might be thinking the EMD SD40-2 was the embodiment of this quote. I mean, you're not wrong. But before the SD40-2, there was one diesel from EMD that was a true jack of all trades. Hello everybody, and welcome to Engines of the Rio Grande, where I cover locomotives that were owned by the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad. In this episode, we will be doing a double take and talk about the Rio Grande's first second generation diesels from EMD, the GP30s and the GP35s. It's the 1960s. The steam engines? They're dead. Well, most of them are dead because of scrapping. By this point, there were still a few that were either being hidden in hopes of preservation, which may or may not have succeeded, just stored awaiting scrapping, or already on display somewhere. On the main lines, it's all EMD now. Almost all EMD now. There were some other manufacturers, but they were less popular and produced diesels with varying degrees of quality compared to EMD. But the point is that every locomotive on the main lines by this point is now a diesel locomotive. However, by this point, trains were still pretty long, and some of the diesels have now begun entering their mid-20s at worst. So the railroads wanted a newer locomotive that could also tackle heavier freight work without constantly needing boosters. Although EMD had the edge in the locomotive market, considering the fact that literally every railroad had EMDs by this point, a challenger had emerged.
She can go lower than I ever really thought she could. Face down.
General Electric, which until the 50s partnered with Alco to produce diesels for the railroads, more on Alco in a future episode since the Rio Grande did own a few Alcos, they broke off from Alco and began producing their own locomotives, the Universal Series, or U-boats. The first of which, the U25B, sold very well. A little too well. EMD's newest offering, the GP20, sold only half the amount GE's offering sold. The U25B was more modern, powerful, and required less maintenance than the GP20. The only diesel that could almost match the U25B in horsepower was Alco's RS27 at 2400 horsepower, which was released a year after the U25B, but only sold 27 units. EMD got to work designing their first second-generation locomotives, because without a really useful competing locomotive, EMD would lose a lot of its business. But it's not like that would actually happen, right? I mean, it's EMD, and nothing bad ever happens to EMD, right? Thankfully, time was on EMD's side, as the railroad industry was in a bit of a slump in the early 1960s, which was pretty much a bad decade for railroads across the world in general, unless your railroad was Japanese or French. That would certainly explain the thumbnail on the Overrated Places video. So EMD went on building their new locomotives, and using the EMD 567 prime mover was able to push 250 and later 500 additional horsepower thanks to DC traction for the new locomotives. However, this put the prime mover at 2,250 horsepower, 250 short of 2,500, and according to EMD's naming practice, this new locomotive would have been classified as the GP22, but EMD scrapped their current naming practices in naming the new locomotive the GP30, as marketing claimed it had 30 distinct improvements from the GP20. Later on in 1963, the GP35 would replace the GP30 in the EMD catalog, and unlike the GP30s, they were able to push 2,500 horsepower. However, this was as far as the EMD 567 engine would be pushed in terms of horsepower, and the next locomotives that EMD sold, the GP40s and GP38s, would include the newer EMD 645 prime mover, which pushed additional horsepower and efficiency. So, how did EMD's second generation diesels do? Holy shit! EMD's first second generation diesels sold like hotcakes. 948 GP30 units would be sold to 30 railroads, nearly double the amount of U25Bs sold by GE. The GP35 sold 1,334 units as well, even more than the GP30s. The GP38 would sell 706 units, while its Dash 2 upgrade would sell more than 3 times the original GP38. And the GP40, as well as its Dash 2 upgrade, would sell almost 2,400 units combined. More on the GP40s in a future episode. While they weren't any SD40-2s, they were still really useful for the railroads for a locomotive that could switch and run on the main line. These locomotives allowed EMD to maintain its dominance over other diesel manufacturers and in the locomotive market. And thankfully, it didn't screw anything up that would cause them to lose their place.
Foreshadowing is a narrative device in which suggestions or warnings about events to come are dropped or planted.
The Southern Railway ended up buying the most GP30s in a high hood variant, while the adjacent Topeka and Santa Fe owned the most GP35s at 161. The Rio Grande would also order the GP30s and GP35s later on. So, how did they fare on the action road? The Rio Grande ordered 28 GP30s in 1962, and like the SD45s, they came in 2 batches. The first batch of 13 units arrived on the Rio Grande from April to May of 1962, numbered 3001 to 3013, while the second batch of 15 units arrived from January to February 1963, numbered 3014 to 3028. Not long afterwards, 22 GP35s would be ordered by the Rio Grande and would also arrive in 2 batches. The first batch of 10 units was delivered in May and June of 1964, numbered 3029 to 3038, picking up where the GP30s left off, while the remaining 12 units were delivered in December 1964 and January of 1965, numbered 3039 to 3050. At first, the 2 diesels look almost similar, though there are a few ways to distinguish them. One way you could tell a GP30 from a GP35 was that the GP30 had a unique hump on the top of its cab. This housed air intakes for its dynamic brakes and centralized air cooling system, a revolutionary feature which was borrowed from the U25B. How ironic. Another way was that the shape of their cabs, when looked at from the front, the GP30's cab had a rectangular look, while the GP35's cab had a trapezoidal look. The GP30 is 8 inches taller than the GP35. Also, the GP35 would usher in a look that would become common for future EMD locomotives. Sorry GP30, no hump day for you. The GP30s and GP35s were great locomotives for the Rio Grande, as both would be very useful for the railroad's fast freights philosophy. The idea being that if the trains were shorter and more frequent, they'd stand a better chance at competing against the dirty and greedy Union Pacific and their overland route. This also became the biggest reason that the G and RGW retired their steam locomotives when they did, which was the late 1940s to 1956, and probably the same reason they didn't bother saving any steam locomotives. Probably because they were still nearly penniless by the time dieselization came around, not to mention they were still suffering from a 1930s bankruptcy, but that's another story, probably for a future episode. One would often see GP30s alongside GP35s on the fast freights of the Rio Grande and on branch line service on the Monarch branch, Tidtick branch, and Aspen branch, just to name a few. The GP30s and GP35s would also be common on the Rio Grande ski train, and in some instances, the Rio Grande Zephyr before the Rio Grande Zephyr was discontinued in 1983. The 2 breeds of diesels don't have that much notable stuff from this time period. Oh wait, except for this. In 1973, Universal produced a television film Runaway, in which a Rio Grande GP30, GP35, and GP40 starred in the movie. What was it about? Well, a link to the movie is in the description, but here are some spoilers for the plot. A passenger train, known as the Ski Special, carrying passengers from the ski slopes, starts down the long grade bound for Jackson City, basically Denver. However, as the train goes down the grade, the engineer, Holly Gibson, played by Western actor Ben Johnson, and the fireman, assistant engineer at this point, Les Reaver, played by Ben Murphy, realize that the train has no brakes, not even the emergency brakes work. With this, it's up to them, the crew of the train, dispatch, and a fellow engineer inside a silver GP40, number 3081, to stop the Runaway from crashing it to Jackson City Station. Will they be able to avoid disaster and save the Ski Special, or will this Ski Special end up victim to one of the deadliest rail disasters to ever occur? In the movie, they used a GP30 number 3011 as the lead locomotive, while GP35 number 3032 was the trailing unit for the Ski Special. The cars used were from the Rio Grande ski train, which I have a whole dedicated video towards. The silver locomotive in the film, meanwhile, is Rio Grande GP40 number 3081. More on the GP40s in the next episode. The locomotives and cars were lettered into the fictional Sierra Pacific Railroad and was filmed at the Winter Park Ski Resort and along the Moffett Line. Though as a personal note, I will admit that when they mentioned the curve they'd supposedly derail on, I was expecting the Big Ten curve to be the supposed curve they derailed at, but it wasn't. The movie was released on the ABC network on September 29, 1973. However, for international releases, the movie was titled The Runaway Train. Yep, before Runaway Train in 1985 and before Unstoppable in 2010, the Rio Grande's Jeeps started a movie about a runaway train. I am not entirely aware of what effects that movie had on the real-life ski train, but given that it wasn't discontinued in 1974, I think it's safe to assume that maybe Runaway had a little bit to do with the ski train continuing until 2009. Going back to the history, in May of 1973, 4 GP30s, 3020, 3021, 3022, and 3027 were leased to the Kennecott Copper Company, along with 8 UP GP30s and 2 ATSF U25Bs, for waste train service in the Bingham Canyon Mine near Salt Lake City, and were renumbered to 704, 722, 726, and 701 respectively. However, it was also around this time that the GP30s began to lead trains less often. With the advent of the GP40, GP40-2, SD45, and SD40T-2, the GP30s began to trail as backup power on freight trains. In 1972, GP30s 3020 through 3028 would begin operating as trailing units only, with the cab seats, toilets, and radios being removed on those units. The same thing happened for the GP35s. As time went on, the two breeds of Jeeps were for the most part being used as either trailing power in a freight train, branch line service, if there were any branch lines still around, yard service, or on maintenance of way. All of the GP30s made it into the Southern Pacific era, except for those that were wrecked, but by the 1990s they began to get retired by the Southern Pacific. Between 1993 and 1995, all but 6 of the GP30s were retired by the Southern Pacific. After retirement, a lot of the GP30s were sold off to companies like National Railway Equipment, Progress Rail, and Omnitrax. Good luck saying that in front of the Winnipeg Rail fan. Some have since been scrapped, while others were sold to other railroads. Thankfully, 2 GP30s are now in preservation. GP30s 3006 and 3011 are now in museums, with 3006 now preserved at the Forney Museum of Transportation in Denver, Colorado, the same museum UP 4005 is preserved at, And 3011, the same GP30 used in Runaway as the leader locomotive, is preserved at the Colorado Railroad Museum in Golden, Colorado. As for the GP35s, they also got their seats, radios, and toilets removed. Unlike the GP30s though, they didn't just do this on a few locomotives, but on the whole goddamn GP35 fleet. Yeah, God forbid you don't have an instance where a GP35 is the only active unit left in an entire train, let alone a yard, switching, or whatever, cause I sure do hope that somebody won't need to sit or use a bathroom or something. Anyways, for the rest of their time on the Rio Grande and later the Southern Pacific, they operated as trailer units for the Rio Grande's trains. In 1993, all the GP35s, the ones that weren't wrecked at some point, except for 3, were retired from the Southern Pacific. However, the Southern Pacific retired the last 3 GP35s in 1994, 95, and 96 respectively. The majority of the GP35s were sold to Omnitrax. However, a few were sold to Watco and Progress Rail, while 3045 was sold to the Wheeling in Lake Erie. Some of them have since been rebuilt and reclassified as 2,000 horsepower GP38-2s or GP38-3s, including 3032, the trailing unit used in Runaway. It was rebuilt into a GP38-2 and later a GP38-3 for the Utah Railway. It's still in service on the Utah Railway as of 2025. When it comes to technical specs for these two locomotives, both the GP30 and the GP35 were equipped with the 16-cylinder EMD 567D3 and 567D3A prime movers respectively. Both had a fuel tank capacity of 1,700 gallons, were equipped with BB Blomberg trucks, weighed 260,000 pounds, had a starting tractive effort of 65,000 pounds and a continuous tractive effort of 50,000 pounds and a top speed of 65 miles per hour. When it comes to length, width, and height, the two locomotives had a length of 56 feet 2 inches and a width of 10 feet 2.5 inches. However, when it comes to the height, the GP30s had a height of 15 feet 11 inches, while the GP35s had a height of 15 feet 3 inches. The two locomotives were equipped with the Nathan M3 air horn. The GP30 would be the first to begin the trend of having M3s equipped on the Rio Grande diesels. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find a sample of the GP30s or GP35s sounding their horns, but here's an example of what they would have sounded like on the two breeds of Jeeps. As mentioned earlier, the GP30s had 2,250 horsepower, while the GP35s had 2,500 horsepower. In addition, while the GP30 maxed out at 835 RPM, the GP35 was higher at 900 RPM. Pretty impressive how both the GP30s and GP35s are similar, yet different in so many ways. And when it comes to their paint schemes, all the GP30s and GP35s had the small lettering scheme, although a few did get the large lettering. GP30s 3001, 3002, 3014, and 3027 received the large lettering scheme, along with GP35 3048. Although the two breeds of diesels are mostly long gone from the mainline trains and are now primarily relegated to short lines, railroad museums, or being rebuilt into road slugs, they will always be a part of the history of the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad, the main line through the Rockies. Thank you all for watching this video. Special thanks to these people here for photos. Next time, I plan on covering EMD's most iconic Jeep, the GP40, of which the Rio Grande owned both the original GP40 and its Dash 2 counterpart. And given the footage of the Rio Grande locomotives that I've been finding over the past couple of videos, I think that this time I will find a lot more footage for the GP40s, both leading trains and also sounding their horns, unlike this episode and the previous episode. Thank you for watching. Feel free to like, share, and hype this video if you liked it, and subscribe to my channel, or else I will send Buster to your house and destroy your house by telling him that your home is a shed. Once again, thank you for watching, and until next time, have a good day.